nevertheless. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to History Matters. And so does coffee. It's not coffee. I won't tell you what it is till later, but it's no caffeine involved in this beverage. So, or alcohol. I'm good. It's the morning. At any rate, welcome. Today we're going to talk about events on Capitol Hill this week. I think I titled it something like Mullin, McCarthy, and Comer, oh my. I have been on every media outlet you can possibly imagine over the full course of the last 48 or 72 hours talking about this. But I'm here to do this for you, and I'm here to do it for you in ways that I have not been able to do it on all these outlets who are like, you have 4 minutes, go. We have many minutes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been thinking about as a historian this week related to this topic. Clearly, I'm going to have a whole lot to say. And then we'll have even more minutes when you guys can ask questions, we can have a conversation. But before we do that, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. Delighted to be with you and to be at home this week, where I can use the Wi-Fi whenever I want. So this is how it works. If you're new to us, welcome. Joanne's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll be back to field your questions. Those go in the Q&A, so you can continue to enjoy the chat. There's a bingo card in there somewhere. All kinds of people adding links and having interesting conversations. But if you have a question about today's topic, that goes down below in the Q&A, and I'll be back in about 30 minutes.
Okay. Wonderful. And I will also say, I'm guessing that there might be some people who are here for the first time, given the timeliness of the topic and the fact that this is what I'm a particular specialist in, violence in Congress. If you are here for the first time, please mention in chat, oh, I'm going to sneeze on, my mother would say sneezing on the truth. Okay, I'm back. Please mention in chat that you are here for the first time, because we have an amazing community here at History Matters, and they will robustly welcome you if you tell people that you're here for the first time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happened on Capitol Hill this last week. I will say, I know this is history education is part of what we're doing here, and particularly given that this is the National Council for History Education, I will mention that when I discovered what was happening on Capitol Hill this past week, I was actually grading papers. I have 15, 20-page rough drafts of research papers that needed to be line edited and this week. So that's what I was doing. And when I got partway through, I said, I'll check, I'll go on a line and see like what's happening out in the world. And lo and behold, the entire world had jumped into my everything, my email, my social media. Everyone was suddenly there saying, Joanne, calling Joanne. And everything imploded. Every media outlet, everything. So it was like, you know, oh, look at this, things are happening, and they're not even just happening once, they're happening 2, 3, or 4 times. So I was surprised by this. Perhaps I shouldn't have been, but I was. And then, of course, the most immediate response I had was, holy smoke, there are so many ways in which what's happening now echoes some of what I've written about in my book. And that continued to happen. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. It continued to happen over the course of the day and into the evening, when among particularly Senator Mullin was talking about what he had done, bragging about what he had done, and talking about it in a variety of ways that literally it was almost as though, you know, let's go to page 92 of The Field of Blood. And I'll talk in a moment about how directly what he was saying connects to some of what I've studied in the pre-Civil War period. And I will say at the outset, and I'll say it again later, all of the comparing and contrasting that I'm doing today, I said this all day yesterday and the day before too, whoever I was talking to, I'm not saying what sometimes media outlets really want me to say, which is, oh, we're on the cusp of a civil war. I will never say that for any number of reasons. Partly because civil war is like a phrase that almost doesn't have meaning. When you say that, people take that to mean, you know, there's going to be a civil war, not thinking about what that really means, like a war. I'm not going to use that phrase in a lighthearted kind of a way. And also, No, I don't think that we're like, here we are, it's 1859, let's go. I think that's a facile, kind of lazy way of thinking about things. So as much as people want me to say that, and have for several years now tried to get me to say that, where there are many bad things happening and worse may happen, and I have been saying that for several years here. But we're on the cusp of civil wars. Not going to be one of them. As a responsible historian, I will not say that. But at any rate, so let's talk a little bit about what happened on Capitol Hill. Obviously, and I'll be talking about this now, it says a lot about the state of the Republican Party at the moment. It says a lot about the state of Congress at the moment. It says a lot about the state of politics right now. It says a lot about the normalization of violence in politics right now, and about a lack of respect generally for institutions of government, but particularly national institutions of government. But let's, what I want to recreate for you here is the string of aha moments that I had as this was unfolding, particularly when it first, the first day when it happened, and then into the evening, again, particularly when Senator Mullin was being interviewed, because so much of it seemed to become right out of my book. Now, first off, the simple fact that there was this kind of, violence is an extreme word, but I would say, you know, allegedly elbowing somebody in a hallway, I could count that as violence, I suppose. So let's say there was an elbowing or a kidney blow, whatever we want to call it, or whatever it might have been, that Senator McCarthy elbowed a colleague in the hallway who had been on the side of ousting him as speaker. We then had also on that same day, Senator Mullin in a hearing get into a tiff, is such the inappropriate word here, argument with the head of the Teamsters, Sean O'Brien, who apparently had made this sentence, folks, some mean tweets about the senator. And the historical example I'm going to offer you here is frighteningly similar. But at any rate, the head of the Teamsters had made at least one mean tweet about Senator Mullin. And Senator Mullin basically said, you want to fight now about it? Let's fight now. I think their phrase was, stand your butt up. Was that the charming, eloquent phrase that came up from that moment? That each one said to the other, you stand your butt up. Charming. I believe Mullin took off his wedding ring to get ready to throw a punch. It was a stellar moment. And I'm going to come back to all of this. And Bernie Sanders said, you know, sit down, you're a US senator, essentially shame on you. Again, right out of history. We also had, I guess it's Congressman Comer called a Democrat a Smurf. Marjorie Taylor Greene called someone a name that I will not say on family-friendly online venues, all on the same day, right? So that was a lot, even in Congress on Capitol Hill. That was a lot. That was sort of like, from a historian point of view, it was like the historian God saying, yo, stuff needs to be talked about right now, and we're going to throw it in your face until you actually pay attention to it and get beyond the, you know, tisk tisk, isn't Congress bad these days, kind of facile way of looking at it. It says a lot more than that. So as a historian, obviously my first response was, holy smoke, there's a violence happening, and that's never a good sign, right? It wasn't a good sign in the period I wrote about. But one thing that is true in the period I wrote about is that it was something of a norm, particularly among Southerners. So I want to talk a little bit about the Southerners in the antebellum Congress, describe them a bit. And in some parts here, I'll let you make some interesting comparisons, but some of the comparing comparisons I'm going to make now are obvious. So number one, let's talk about who the Southerners were in the 1840s, 1850s. By that point, with the issue of slavery on the national agenda front and center for quite some time, they wanted what they wanted, and nothing was going to hold them back from getting it. And what they wanted was the protection of slavery in the way that they wanted it, in the form that they wanted it. They wanted no opposition to slavery, and they were going to do in Congress what it took to silence opposition on slavery. And when it came to violence, what that meant was people who dared to stand up and speak against violence, to propose or discuss legislation that might affect slavery in one way or another, that basically anyone that had anything to say about slavery that was negative, Southerners wanted to silence them, and they silenced them with threats, and sometimes actual violence, by bullying. And I've said this before many times on this program, that threats have power if they're credible. You don't necessarily always have to be violent to have a threat have power and do its work. And that's a lot of what we saw, certainly in Congress in the decades before the Civil War. There were instances of violence. There were many. I found them. There were over 70 in the House and Senate in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. But far more than that were threats of violence, which were credible and powerful and had an impact because people, for good reason, readily believed that if a Southerner threatened you, they might carry out that threat. So that kind of bullying behavior, past and present, has an impact if people believe that the person might carry through on the threat. That's what bullies are about. And I kind of hate the word bully because it kind of belittles what I think is far more than what might think of as something that, you know, younger people do to each other. And there isn't a better word than bully that I can find that captures quite what it's about. But bullying really is, I threaten to do harm to you in a credible way so that you darn well better run or cooperate, because I will do harm to you. There's nothing really comical about that, although it's easy to make it seem comical. That's some of what we were seeing in Congress, and that's certainly what the Southerners were doing in Congress in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Now, one thing that happened a lot in that time period is Southerners would pull a gun on someone, or pull a knife on someone, or suggest that they were going to challenge someone to a duel, or, you know, maybe not elbow someone, but shove someone, or in the most famous violent incident in Congress, cane someone. But there was a good amount of shoving. Basically, like, I don't respect you, I'm going to shove you. I'm not going to do serious harm, but I'm going to show you exactly what I think about you. That went on quite a bit in those early decades. And it happened enough that there used to be a kind of response that, again, normally it was Northerners who would respond to those moments when they were grievous enough. Someone would stand up and say, "Shame on you. Shame on you. This is the US Congress. You shouldn't be behaving that way. That what about the rules? What about the institution?" This happened so frequently that John Quincy Adams, who left his presidency, went back to Congress, and not the Senate, but the House, served in the House after his presidency. John Quincy Adams came up with a nickname for that kind of, you know, shame on you speech that came after a bad incident. He called them lamentation speeches. And in his diary, what you see in his diary is he'll say something like, in his wonderful sort of sardonic John Quincy Adams way, "Mr. Smith raised his cane at Mr. Jones," and instantly the lamentation speeches. And people would do precisely what Bernie Sanders did after Senator Mullin did what he did, right? Bernie Sanders, "Shame on you, you're a US Senator, sit down." Again, as a historian who's written about this, that was a sort of eye-opening moment. It's like, holy smoke, like, that's essentially a lamentation speech. It's a shaming moment, and it's someone who won't engage in that kind of behavior. And again, I will be talking about people on the right and Republicans, because a lot of the bad behavior that we saw, and I'm going to talk about the reasons why, was coming from the right, was coming from Republicans. And in that case, it was a Democrat that came up with the lamentation speech. "Shame on you, sit down, you're a US Senator." And it seemed to have somewhat, at least for the moment, de-escalated things. But at any rate, there you see someone behaving as my Southerners would have, and someone behaving as my Northerners would have, and saying, "Shame on you, what about the institution of Congress?" Now, clearly, all of this behavior going on does not say a lot about respect for the institution of Congress. And again, in the time period that I write about, the Southerners were far more interested in getting what they wanted in the way they wanted it than they were with respecting the institution of Congress in any way. they were, in their case, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, today's Republicans are not a united pack, but generally speaking, the Southerners in antebellum America and Congress were a very united pack of people when it came to slavery. They were going to defend slavery. They were going to do what it took to defend slavery. They would sometimes like walk up in a group and storm off when someone said something they didn't like. So in that sense, there was a difference. But again, rules didn't matter. Norms and conventions, generally speaking, were not at the forefront of their mind when they were doing what they wanted to do to defend slavery. An instance that took place again in antebellum America that had such interesting and bizarre echoes with what we saw having to do with the Republican Party now. Mullin, the Mullin incident happened in a committee hearing. So there were cameras there. He knew there were cameras there. The McCarthy incident in the hallway actually was, in a sense, less public, although thanks to technology, it became public. I'm going to come back to that because you all know that that's a favorite topic of mine, which is the impact of technology on democracy. But for a moment, talking about Mullin in the committee hearing, there's this, again, despite everything we know about politics right now, stunning moment of I'm taking off my wedding ring, I'm ready to go and, basically slug you within the walls of the Capitol building. Let's talk for a moment about something that happened in the 1840s, in which there was a committee hearing. And there was a witness testifying. And this particular witness had said something nasty about a Southerner, Bailey Peyton, in the newspaper. Not a tweet, but the equivalent. He'd said something nasty about Bailey Peyton, a Southerner, in the newspaper. So there's the hearing. There's this fellow who's testifying at the hearing. Bailey Peyton doesn't like this guy, really doesn't like this guy, begins disrespecting him in a variety of ways during the hearing. I don't like your voice. I don't want to hear from you. I don't even want you to be here. Basically, in one way or another, sort of mildly threatening. And then at a certain point, Bailey Peyton loses his patience and leaps to his feet and reaches seemingly for a gun. So the witness is alarmed. Other people in the room sort of see that it appears that a congressman is going to pull a gun on a witness, and this isn't good. Virginia Congressman Henry Wise, who I'm going to come back to momentarily, rushes over, not to stop Peyton, but to be by his side in case he needs to pull his gun too. This isn't a hearing room. It's during a hearing, and what you have is several Southerners who are prepared to do physical harm to a witness who they don't like. These are not people who are respecting the institution of Congress. These are people who want to intimidate someone who they don't like, someone who politically is against them and personally has been insulting, intimidate him into compliance or silence, and show other people that they should behave the same way. So again, when I saw what was happening in the hearing room, I am the probably person in the nation who said, oh my gosh, Bailey Peyton. and the incident from the 1840s, right? That tells you so much about this moment that I'm comparing it to this other moment when you had Southerners with no respect for the institution of Congress, generally, not all Southerners, but a lot of them, doing whatever it took to get what they wanted, regardless of the rules. Now, I've mentioned Henry Wise. This is another person who popped into my head during events over the course of the last week. And this again, Senator Mullin raised this for me as well. In the evening after all of the charm that unfolded during the day, he said on some interview, I cannot keep track of all of the places in which he appeared and made statements that were, they were statements, all right. In this case, he said his constituents liked that behavior. They expected it of him. They wanted him to fight for them. Now, this literally, I did not have time before preparing this morning to find the page in my book where this appears, but Henry Wise of Virginia, who is my most frequent fighter in the book, constantly, actually, he didn't take off his wedding ring, but he liked to roll up his sleeves to get ready to fight. So definite comparison there. But Henry Wise, at one point, during the lamentation speeches, after he did something unacceptable and yet acceptable to Southerners, someone said to him, again, during debate on the floor, shame on you. Shame on you. Since this Congress has started, you've already been involved in X number of incidents. We should throw you out of here. We should expel you. You don't deserve to be here. And this is what Henry Wise said in response. Do it. Do it. Expel me. Go ahead. You know what? I'm going to be put right back in here. You know why? My constituents want me to do this. They put me here to do this. They want me to fight for them. And as proof of that, it wasn't just Henry Wise sort of grandstanding about this. The antebellum Congress was not a time when people had careers, lifetime tenures in Congress. Very often people would come and spend one term in Congress and then go home. So there were a lot of one-term wonders in Congress in that time period. Henry Wise was reelected 6 times. Henry Wise's people knew precisely what he was doing. He advertised it. There were jokes about it. As a matter of fact, after the committee room incident in which he rushed over and stood ready with his gun to help out his pal Bailey Peyton, there was a joke circulating around Washington at the time when the next session opened, and he was late, I think, coming to Congress, and the joke was, well, you know, he forgot his guns and had to go back home and get them because he can't come here without his guns because he needs his guns in Congress. So Henry Wise saying, my constituents want me to behave this way, and indeed his constituents did want him to behave that way. Again, that was almost verbatim what came out of the mouth of Senator Mullin this past week. On many levels, you could see how my historian brain was sort of, you know, oh, not again. Like, it's one thing to say there's violence or there's threats of violence or there's misbehavior or there's members of Congress behaving badly. And we have been, certainly this is not the first time we've talked about that. Definitely not the first time this has happened, even in the recent past. But when you get to the level that people are proud of the violence, are bragging about the violence, are engaging in gratuitous violence just for the seeming personal pleasure of it, in a moment of extreme division in the Republican Party, that's a different kind of threat. That's a different kind of discord. And that's what we were seeing this week. And that's why, again, as a historian, I see we're running out of time, so I want to mention a few more things. As a historian, this said to me a lot about the state of the Republican Party right now, about the state of the nation, about the state of Congress. There's one thing I want to mention before I come to that conclusion, because I mentioned it at the outset, and I don't want to end without mentioning it, which is technology. And certainly one of the reasons why the Mullin incident was known and had the impact it did was it went viral. And again, thanks to social media. And in the case of the McCarthy incident, there was a reporter there, so she actually recorded the audio of what was happening. But in the case of Mullin, it went viral over various forms of media. I was sent images, footage of it to see within moments that it happened. Again, as I've said many times before, as soon as you have technology that's capable of altering the ways in which members of, politicians generally and the public engage with each other, you're going to alter the nature of democracy in a fundamental way. So what we saw was this really unacceptable moment. We instantly knew about it, and it kind of alters the way that it played out and the impact it had. A great example of that, I know I've spoken about this before, in 1850, one senator, Henry Foote of Mississippi, pulled a gun on another senator, Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. And there was what someone at the time called a stampede, where members of the Senate either rushed to the spot to do something about it. Many of them jumped on desks to get a look, because that is what happened typically during moments of violence in Congress. There was a sort of momentary scuffle. Someone grabbed the gun out of Foote's hand, locked it in a desk, and everybody went to sit down and go back to work, because that's also what happened typically during these, or just after these moments in Congress, because they were, if not exactly routine, common enough to not seem totally abnormal. But at that moment, a senator from New Hampshire stood up, and this is the technology component of what happened in 1850. He said, before we all go back to work, I hope everyone in this room realizes that within 45 minutes, because of the telegraph, the nation will be reading that we're slaughtering each other in here with guns. we have no control over that spin. It's going to be out. The nation's going to be seeing it. What are we going to do about that? So in essence, this senator from New Hampshire stood up and said, this is about to go viral. What are we going to do about that? Because the country's going to see it. The country's going to draw conclusions based on it. And we don't control that. That will shape the nation in ways that we can no longer control. Now, the response at the time is kind of telling. The response was, let's say we're going to have an investigation. Yeah, that's it, right? That's the ticket. Let's have an investigation. If we announce to the public that we're going to have an investigation over this, it will seem like we're in control and we're taking charge and we're going to restore order, which, you know, there was an investigation and really nothing much happened because of it. But the point being, technology took this moment and blew it up and spread it around to the nation and gave it an additional and a different kind of impact than it might have had before. And that's precisely what we saw again with this moment in Congress that might have happened and we might not have known about it. Again, an important thing to consider. I mentioned at the start of my book an incident that happened that former Speaker John Boehner mentioned, that before he was Speaker, someone pulled a knife on him, I believe in the House chamber. And the moment passed, but no one knew about it. We know about it because when Boehner was reflecting on his time as Speaker and before Speaker, his time in Congress, he mentioned it. And he mentioned it as I was finishing up the book. And I read it somewhere and I was like, I didn't hear about a knife being pulled on anybody in the House. You have to know there's other moments that have been happening that have been, there's been shoving and any number of other things that have happened that we don't know about because of technology. We know about these, and I'm sure we'll know about others to come. Okay, the larger point here is now that I've talked about all of these ways in which what we're seeing now so profoundly echoes what happened in the 19th century. What does this tell us? Well, for one thing, it certainly shows us ways in which violence, which was normalized and was common in the antebellum America, has become normalized to a degree now that it wasn't one sort of freakish incident of this happening. It just happened all day. That our political rhetoric, our discourse, politics itself now has become in some ways violent to the point that it now seems almost normal, certainly to the people engaged in it. They didn't act as though what they were doing was abnormal. They just did it. I mean, you know, McCarthy denies that he did the hallway elbowing or the kidney shot or whatever you want to call it. But if indeed he did that, that's a member of Congress who's just like, shove, I'm going to keep going and doing what I'm doing, as though that's a normal thing to do, right? As though that's a thing you do and then you just keep walking and okay. Or again, the fact that in the middle of a hearing, it seems appropriate to someone to engage in that kind of talk, to engage in that kind of behavior, or in the middle of congressional business to call someone a smurf. You're a smurf. You look like a, really? Like that's, I want to pay my taxpayer dollars for that moment of high dialogue and purpose. So in part, obviously, what we saw is an indication of the degree to which violence, violent talk, violent actions have been and are becoming even more normalized in a way that should be alarming to us. There was a lot of talk, and there should have been, and so I'm glad there was, of what former President Trump said when he used the word vermin to refer to his political opponents, and the ways in which that, I don't even want to say echoes Nazis, simply repeats precisely what the Nazis said about their opponents to dehumanize them, right? We're no longer talking echoing the past. We're just talking about like directly quoting it for similar purpose, right? So there's an act that got people talking about the normalization of that sort of thing and what it means, but we were seeing more of it in Congress, more indication of it in Congress. We also, part of what was seen, so the Southerners in the mid-19th century were kind of a unified pack when it came to slavery most of the time. Some of what we saw this past week has to do with the precise opposite with the Republican Party, because what we saw was a direct reflection of the state of the Republican Party, which is so fractured that there's no party discipline. There's no ability for the party to rein people in, to get them to cooperate in some way, to give them some sense of shared purpose so that they don't engage in that kind of ridiculous behavior against each other, never mind against their opponents. The party is fractured to the extent that that kind of behavior can't be reined in, isn't being reined in, is just reflective of where the party is now. So certainly that, among other things, is a real in-your-face sign of the degree to which that party is fractured, has no shared purpose, no shared leadership, no sort of sense of immediacy of what needs to be done, and as many have been saying, seemingly no ability to govern, given all of that fracture inherent in the Republican Party. There is one last thing that I want to mention, which I mentioned at some point online, and whenever you mention mansplaining or manliness as a woman, men get very mad. But I'm going to say this anyway, because we are a community. One thing that we certainly saw with all of the bullying and chest beating and behavior that we saw this past week, one might think that it's a sign of strength, but it's quite the opposite. It's a sign of fear and weakness, right? If you know you're in trouble, if you're afraid of losing power, that's when you begin to engage in that kind of display. That's when you begin to feel the need to show off how strong you are. That's when you begin to deliberately violate rules, not because you feel calm and in control, because you feel threatened, out of control, and fearful of losing what you want to keep. It's a sign of fear and weakness and desperation. It's what you do when you feel threatened. And so one thing, oddly enough, it might seem counterintuitive. I see all of these thumbs up going along the side of the screen. One of the things to bear in mind, and it's counterintuitive, but I think it's important, this behavior that we saw, violent, threatening, unacceptable, saying so many bad things about the nation and about the Congress, what it also says is that these people feel threatened. They feel as though they're not necessarily going to get what they want, and they're willing to do anything to get what they want. Now, that's alarming. That's a bad message, but it's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness. And it's important to bear that in mind, not so that we can laugh it or them off and say, oh, well, you know, they know they're weak. We can ignore this. You know, it's all just a joke. Not for that reason, but as an indication that, and a reminder that it's not as though everything is over. It's not as though everything is sunk. It's not as though we're going down as a national ship. That we are in a moment when what we do and what we say and what we accept or don't accept matters profoundly. And the fact that that behavior, as upsetting as it is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength. That's important to bear in mind. That should be motivation for people to push back harder against the unacceptable right now, in this moment. That was a signal, oddly enough, that there can be power in pushing back, because these people don't feel in control. If they felt in control, none of that would have happened. That's vitally important. And when you are talking about, and we've been talking about this, and certainly I have for a long time, when you are talking about the preservation and future of democracy and democratic governance, that kind of reminder can't be more important. This is ongoing. We're in a moment where what we do matters. Certainly our votes matter, but what we do matters. What happened this week was an advertisement of the fact that these people are not in control, that they feel as though they don't have their grip on what they want, and they're going to do whatever it takes to try and get it. We need to hear that. We need to see that. We need to remember that. And that needs to inspire us to push for something better, to push back against that kind of unacceptable behavior, but equally, if not more important, to push for something better, to come forward, speak up, and try and put things in a better place, because that's that should be the message of what we saw this last week. Again, counterintuitive, but really, really important. Okay, I've gone way over. I'm going to stop. I'm going to remove my notes here, which I kind of left because I can't see the mugs. And right, thank you, Cece. If I can't see the mugs, then somehow something's wrong. Now, I want to mention two things really quickly before we go to questions. Number one is today's mug is a new mug that came as a gift. mug rant. That represents precisely what I did today. George Tonkin, is he here? Is George Tonkin here? I can't hear you, Annie. Are you muted?
Sorry, yes.
There you go. You're back. Okay.
He's here.
Okay. So George.
He's here.
George is here. George sent me a mug.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Well, so it's Presidents of the United States from Virginia. And I was not speaking about presidents today, but it's Virginia. It's Virginia. And given that I was talking about Henry Wise, we got John Tyler, we got Zachary Taylor, we got James Madison, we got all the people you would
Washington, Jefferson,
it says authentic signatures. These are authentic signatures. But at any rate, first of all, George, thank you very much. But I was going to use a different mug, a really obvious mug, but I've used it before, and I was so excited that I had a Virginia mug that I could use today. So
we're in Virginia.
In doing that, I also wanted to thank Sandy Fong, and I hope I've gotten your name right, who sent me a really, really sweet card last week, and I had it sitting next to me here, and I forgot to say thank you for it. I hope I won't embarrass you.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Anyway, I didn't want to thank George without thanking Sandy. So thank you.
Best community.
We are the best community. We are an amazing community. Okay, now that I've ended my rant,
mug rant.
That's right. Let's. I got really ranty yesterday several times. Actually, I almost made one reporter cry. So because I started talking about democracy. Anyway, coming down. Let's open things up. Let me open chat again. Let's open things up for questions.
So Gloria is on fire today, Joanne. She, I'm going to kind of combine two.
Okay.
She was talking about when you said that the one gentleman in Congress said, I'm going to bring it, I'm going to do it again. You can go ahead and dispel me because my constituents want it. So I'm going to kind of combine because George had a similar question. Gloria said, when you act according to your constituents, isn't that democracy? Who's more responsible for behavior, the instigator or the person who responds?
Both. And so here's what I have to say to that. I talked a little bit about this yesterday. It is very true that if the person is behaving this way and says, my people love it, the people are responsible too. But let's look for a moment at what people said. Let's go to the 19th century again. What people said when there was obviously a problem with members of Congress who were willing to duel. This was a problem. John Quincy Adams actually spoke out against the fact that Southerners were willing to be violent, willing to duel. It gave them an advantage in Congress. He was that explicit about it. They were willing to do things others wouldn't, and so people kowtowed to them. Here's what sermons and lectures and pamphlets and newspapers said about that problem. They said, we have all of these politicians who are willing to duel and are willing to use those kinds of threats to get what they want. So American public, don't vote for people who are willing to duel. Don't vote for them. Don't give them power. This is not just on them. This is you, right? You are giving these people power. Now, that's not a solution, because if Senator Mullin says, my people love this, and his people say, yes, we love it, and we're going to reelect him, that's a problem. And that is how democracy works, right? You as the public, you vote for what you want, and ideally, again, with a free and fair electoral system and people who are eligible to vote all being able to vote, you get an outcome ideally, you have people who accept the outcome and don't pretend that it never happened because they don't like it. But assuming that we have elections functioning in a normal way, yeah, potentially you end up with something that really you might not like, which is a bunch of people who like that behavior and reelect someone like that into office. That's democracy. But that gets back to my rant at the end of my comments today, which is what we do matters. And some of that might be pushing back, objecting, doing any number of other things to voice loudly what we think. But it also has to do with not giving power to people who are going to misuse it. So yeah, it is democracy. It's a reminder of the fact that it isn't just these guys. And right now we are, well, I know Marjorie Taylor Greene, so not just guys, largely guys. It's not just these people that we're talking about. It's us. And Congress is a representative institution, or it should be. It's supposed to represent us. It's supposed to represent our demands. It's supposed to be grounded on the votes, needs, demands, desires of constituents. And given that, yeah, we're responsible for who is there. If electoral systems or legislatures or any number of other things are being messed with, people are being denied the vote, if there are things happening on a state level that are going to shape the degree to which we can all take part in free and fair elections, then yeah, that matters too. So yes, Gloria, I would say that that is correct. This is democracy at work, but it's just yet another reminder for why we matter, for why what we do matters, and why we shouldn't give power. Some people will. Some people will want to give power to people like that. And yes, that is democracy. And this is certainly not the first time that a person willing to engage in that kind of behavior, obviously, based on everything I'm saying, and I've been talking about the 1840s and 1850s, but there are lots of other people in Congress and outside of Congress who have been willing to engage in very questionable behavior on behalf of their constituents, and were given power for that reason. But we matter. This is still a democratic system of government. It is democracy, and for that reason, don't sit back. Don't assume everything's going to be okay, and don't assume everything's going to be terrible. I talked about this a good amount yesterday too. Don't fall into easy American exceptionalism that it's always been okay before and it will always be okay in the future because it's always okay because we're the United States. That's lazy thinking, and we're not necessarily, you know, again, so the first, when I first did like a sample one of these History Matters and sent it in to NCHE, and like, what if I do this sort of thing every week? Part of what I said was that, like, why it's important at this particular moment, and this was years ago now, why it's important to understand that we're at this, I'm going to say it, moment of extreme contingency. If people are playing bingo, someone just got bingo. That in this moment of extreme contingency, things can go horribly, horribly wrong, but things can also get better if we realize that outcomes aren't determined yet, that things are still being decided, discussed, engaged in, that we're in a process, and that we need to realize we are in the middle of this process, and we need to be in the moment, and we need to push for the decent, push for what we want in a democratic form of government. Okay, stepping back off the soapbox, I'm sorry.
So we have a lot of mind melds going on today, because this question is from both Cece and Troy, and it's basically the same question. So again, I'm going to combine them. They're both talking about, after Charles Sumner's, the caning incident, were there new rules instituted in Congress to try and stop and penalize violence? And what have we learned as a nation about how to manage this type of behavior in Congress? You know, have those laws changed over the years, and how's that all panned out?
Yeah, no, there weren't new laws put in place after the caning of Sumner. I mean, there was an investigation. Something just went bing here, and I don't know what. There was obviously an investigation. The findings of the investigation, in and of themselves, were a little alarming and of the moment, as opposed to being comforting and, yeah, let's get new rules. Preston Brooks, according to some who were on that investigative committee, Preston Brooks was at fault not simply for caning Sumner, but because he knew that Sumner was typically unarmed and he didn't warn him in advance. So according to some who were investigating in Congress that incident, what the moral of the story was, if Brooks had warned Sumner in advance, then Sumner might have been able to arm himself and it would have been much more fair. That's not a good lesson. That's not the lesson we want people to learn from an incident like that. So, and not only that, but I talked about this at some point yesterday too. I've been talking a lot over the last 48 hours. One of the things I mentioned was after the caning of Sumner, 1856, there's an incident, I mentioned it in my book, in which a Massachusetts congressman had gone back to Massachusetts, was at the train station in Massachusetts heading back to Washington, and his constituents met him at the train station with a gift, a parting gift to take with him to Washington. It was a gun, and it was inscribed with the words "free speech." His constituents basically said, you go back there and you fight. Here's a gun. That's not necessarily the lesson one would wish. It's understandable, right? Because what his constituents were saying was, our senator was just literally beaten to the ground by a Southerner. You need to go back and speak for us. And actually, generally speaking, what people said was not take the gun and use it, but take the gun and make sure people know you have it, that you're ready to fight if someone forces you to. I thought about this morning and I didn't find a way to weave it into my comments. When you get at the last few years before the Civil War, the birth of the Republican Party as it existed in the 19th century, which is not the same thing as the party now, there were Republicans who came to Congress 1856, 1857, and they came armed and ready to fight. I know I've spoken about this before too. They ran on the message that they were going to be the party that fights the slave power. And in Congress, that had a real ring to it. There was a reality to it. And some of them came to Congress with guns. They didn't come with guns saying, okay, ready to go, let's shoot it out. They came with guns. In one case, an Ohio congressman, an Ohio senator, like put his gun down on his desk as if to say, yeah, okay, like I'm here. Not, I want to use it, but I'm here. And a number of other members of Congress in that moment, when Southerners tried to bully them, said again and again and again, this is all, as I mentioned before in the book, we're a different kind of congressman now from the North. Northerners are electing different people to be here, and we're not going to sit down and allow this to happen anymore. We're going to stand up. We're a different kind of member of Congress. Oops, sorry, which gets back to what I was just talking about, which is we vote for these people. In 1856, 1857, Northerners said, okay, we're going to put people in office now who are not violent, but are not just going to sit down in the face of what's going on. We're going to bring people who are willing to stand up. And they did. They brought people who were going to treat that kind of threat differently. So again, democracy does matter, even when it is endangered in some way, maybe more so in that moment, it really matters. I'm talking so much and so fast that I'm not even keeping track of the chat.
No, I know. And I'm trying to keep track of the chat and the Q&A. Okay. Yeah. Dave, our good buddy Dave, has a question about newspapers, since we talked about Above the Fold earlier. He said, to the extent that historians comb through old newspapers to uncover what happened, and given the New York Times for decades has been known as a newspaper of record, he wanted you to comment on the recent New York Times headline, Trump campaign officials tried to play down contentious 2025 plans. He said, if that's in general that newspapers aren't as reliable to be a source of actual facts, what will be the sources that the future historians can turn to? Because I guess what he's saying is the media lately has been downplaying some of the more abhorrent behavior. And so what will be our source if we can't even trust the newspapers anymore to report the facts?
Well, let me flip that question on its head a little bit, because if I'm a historian in 40, 50 years looking back at this moment and I see that headline, that's an absolute reflection of where we are right now, because what that says is people are profoundly underestimating what's going on. That's a sign, that's evidence of the press responding absolutely incorrectly to what's unfolding. That's a sign of aspects of the press really not doing their job in just reporting facts. It's proof of people sort of denying or not seeing or ignoring what's in the air around them in one way or another. So as a historian, I would see that as Okay, well, there you go. Look at what's happening. As a historian, I can see what's happening. I can see the language. I can see the behavior. I can see the threats. I see this whole vermin thing. And the response is contentious election or rhetoric going in a different direction or whatever the sort of nonsensical headlines have been in a variety of newspapers, including the New York Times. As a historian, that to me would be evidence of precisely what's going on in this moment, and it's bad. Like what we are seeing, and this again relates to what happened this past week in Congress, we are seeing more than danger signals, right? We're seeing people, and particularly with that vermin comment, we're not seeing people playing at fascism. We're seeing people engaging in, at least in the case of former President Trump, that's fascism. It just is. If you're saying that my opponents are vermin and they need to be destroyed, and when people call you out for it and say, you just said that, and your response is, yeah, we did. And if you don't like it, we're going to crush you when we win, which is what happened. That's fascism. It is. And I hate using isms because in the same way that I don't want to toss around the word civil war, when you use isms, I think to some degree people tune out because it sounds like this ism thing that's complicated and people aren't going to engage in. But we're not looking at play acting. We're looking at the thing. And if in this kind of moment, the press is saying, tisk, tisk, politics are contentious, oh, well, maybe, that's irresponsible. So yeah, and oddly enough, I know this isn't what the question was, but the answer is, as a historian, that's absolutely wonderful, wonderful historic evidence because it really reflects a profoundly problematic thing that's going on right now. Now, as far as what I would, as a historian, look for evidence of what's really happening, you're right. I would have to do seemingly a lot of what I did for the 19th century, which is not rely on any one newspaper, not rely on any one form of evidence. I was triangulating all over the place when I was writing that book because I couldn't believe any newspaper or any, I would say if I wanted to know that something was true, I had to see it in more than one kind of evidence. So a newspaper and or the record and or someone's diary and or someone's memoir. No one form of evidence was enough for me to actually know what happened because I knew the degree to which things were being masked or hidden or ignored. So future historians are going to have to do, in a way, any historian has to do that in any time, right? Consider the nature of the evidence, consider who's creating it, consider the circumstances under which it's made. But people will have to do that in the future too. So it's not as though because we live in modern times, our evidence somehow should be purer than other evidence. Evidence is always a product of the moment and of particular people and circumstances. As a future historian, I would know what this moment is, and I would judge the evidence I'm seeing with that kind of knowledge in mind.
Yeah. We've got a couple of follow-up questions. Linda, talking about being very appalled by the Veterans Day comment that the former president made using the word vermin. And she said, is the role of the media in their own demise, what will come next? Will the press stand up to people? Have they done that before in the past in history when they stood up to bullies?
Yeah, so yes, the press has stood up before. Again, contingency. We don't know what's coming next. We don't. I will say, and we see it in big ways and small ways all the time, when people speak up and complain loudly in big groups, sometimes that has an impact, and again, I can't speak about the particulars of the dynamic of why things happen, but like we saw Scholastic books say, hey, guess what? We're going to segregate all books that someone might consider problematic. And then everyone spoke up against it. And then suddenly it was like, walking it back. Okay, maybe we're not going to do that anymore. What just happened this week? Oh, there was a town. I don't know which town it was. I saw both halves of this morning, and so I might be incorrect. But what I read this morning, running around trying to decide what I wanted to say for this, was that there was a town that declared public displays of homosexuality illegal. And that then, because there was so much protest, that it immediately backed down. Someone else will have to find this. Tennessee, thank you. That's right, because someone said it shouldn't be Murfreesboro, like the word free should no longer be in its name. At any rate, my larger point here is speaking up matters. Again, democracy, if there are a lot of people and they're very loud and they don't like what's happening and they speak up against it, that can matter. You know, and again, I know I said this, at this point, we've been here doing this so long that I almost say almost everything I say, like, I've said this before. I have said this before, right? One of the distinctive things about our government, acknowledged at the time, is that in a democratic Republican form of government, public opinion matters more, far more than it does in a monarchy. And that the founding generation knew that. They didn't quite know who the public was or how to know what they thought, but they knew that that fact was important and they thought about it all the time. And it's true, right? Public opinion matters. We forget that. We've forgotten it, I think, when we took democracy for granted and thought it just goes of itself. We forget it when we assume everything's going to be okay and we can just sort of sit back, because in the end, we always have been okay and we're going to be. We matter. What we do and what we say matters, and what we don't do and what we don't say matters. And this is a moment when we really, really, really need to bear that in mind. And again, I think that's some of what the chest beating that we saw in Congress this week is a reminder of weakness and of the fact that what we do and say can matter.
There have been a couple of folks. Do we have time? I think we're already 2 minutes over. Can we take one more?
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of folks have asked about the threats to members of Congress, particularly members who are trying to sort of be towards the middle and reach across the aisle. It seems like in more recent weeks, they're the ones that are now the targets of bullies and more serious threats. So a couple of folks, including Frida, wanted to know if you could comment on that. This idea of bullying and threatening the families as a way to leverage or being primaried, you know, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, this is the most obvious thing in the world, but obviously that's unacceptable. The families of people, or even more broadly, attacking people who are just too neutral for someone's liking, right? That happened in 19th century America. There's a Massachusetts politician, I believe it was Edward Everett, who at one point said, I'm too in the middle, like I'm not willing to speak out in an extreme way, and people are coming at me because I'm not willing to be extreme. And I didn't go to a meeting. I chose not to go to this meeting because it seemed too extreme for me. And now I'm being, like, not physically attacked, but attacked because I didn't attend the meeting. That, you know, someone quoted me online somewhere in the last week saying it's hard to be a person of moderation in immoderate times. You know, that's part of what we're talking about here. The question really more is people attacking people who aren't even necessarily in the political realm. Obviously that's wrong. Obviously that's should be a not just wrong, but a crime of a different kind. It should be, it's a crime to attack anyone in that manner. But the families of people, but that's another case in which if people who engage in that kind of behavior, if others come forward within the same party as the people doing it and say that's unacceptable, this is another thing. And it's changed in the last 24 hours, right? One of the things I started to say early on in the course of this past week was, where are the Republicans speaking up and saying this kind of behavior is unacceptable? This is not what we do. Because initially I didn't see any. I saw bad behavior and a whole heck of a lot of silence. And silence, in some cases, can be compliance. Silence can be cooperation. Silence can be a way of saying, well, this behavior was bad, and if we don't protest against it, then I guess that's the state of the party. So people need to speak out against it. And particularly in the case of some of the stuff we're talking about here, you know, attacking the families of people, people who are on the side of those attackers, people of power need to step up and say, that's wrong. I don't care if you agree with me or not. Unacceptable. That's not what we do. That's not who we are as a party. And there's not a lot of that talk going on. And that's a longstanding thing, right? That you see, I mean, think all the way back. I think all the way back of seeing some of what was going on in Congress. And this is back before Twitter was as horrible as it is now. And I went into a direct message and said to a colleague who's an expert on modern politics, like, I don't know, like, why are Republicans so quiet right now when some things are happening, and Republicans, some of them should be speaking up and saying this is unacceptable, or why are they not? And I remember how alarmed I was when this historian expert person said, I don't know why either, and it's alarming. the lack of a willingness of people to say, nope, drawing the line, not acceptable. I don't care who you are. I don't care how much power you have. That's not what we do as a party. That's not what we do as a nation. To do that loudly, to do that in groups, to do that in a way where it matters, we're not seeing a lot of that, and that's alarming too. That's depending on the circumstances, can be seen as the dereliction of duty and of compliance, and basically just saying, oh well, I don't like it, but it's happening, so I'm just going to sit here. And it's happening. Yeah. That's not what leaders do, or what they should do in a democracy.
You've got just as many questions left that didn't get answered, but it's already 6 after. So
here's what I say. What if we do this again next week?
Well, next week's Thanksgiving, so the week after.
Okay, week after. So what if I will, so it's true, I'm going to have to pre-record next week's Thanksgiving. So next week I will comment on this in a general kind of a way that is holiday appropriate, since I want us all to be happy for Thanksgiving. But what if we have a kind of state of the nation conversation week after Thanksgiving? Questions that, yes, holiday appropriate, Carly. What if we save these questions? As a matter of fact, if there are more questions you want to ask, put them in chat right now, or I'm sorry, put them in the Q&A. Put them in the Q&A, not chat. Put them in the Q&A right now, and we'll take them all. And the week after Thanksgiving, we'll have part 2 of this conversation.
So Carolee and I will not see you for 2 whole weeks.
Oh, that's true.
Because we're presenting at the same time as History Matters. Boo-hoo. But Jessica, I think, is going to fill in, is what I heard. So Jessica, and she'll be at the conference, so I think she's going to do it live from her booth.
Oh, well, whoever will be doing it.
It's Jessica.
It'll be Jessica. Okay.
That's what
we will be doing it. We will continue this conversation. We'll have kind of a state of the nation conversation. Put your questions in Q&A. And as a matter of fact, if you think of questions that you don't get in Q&A, maybe send them to Annie, and they can, or send them to Annie, who can tack them on or something. So we'll have these conversation, because there's obviously a lot to say, and I'll still be worked up then. Okay, so we're running over, so let me move us to phase 2. Okay, so first off, thank everyone for being here as ever, but particularly today, when we're at a moment where a lot is happening, and it's upsetting, and it matters to all of us and to the United States writ large, for us to be able to gather here and engage in conversation and ask questions and worry about things and think about solutions together, as one can do in a democracy, matters a lot. So as ever, thank you for being here and engaging in the conversation of democracy, and today a particularly urgent conversation of democracy, but always an important conversation. Thank you for being here. That's right. Cece says, unless something else happens in the meantime, don't even say that. I also, first off, want to thank, as ever, Annie and John for being here and making this possible. I want to, before I forget, and I will do it again after we go to the after party, which we're about to do. But before we go to the after party, I do also want to say, everyone, have a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving, Friendsgiving, whatever giving it is you're engaging in. Have a happy time. Be with people of some kind. Relax. And give thanks for the fact that there is good of some kind in your life, that it involves people you love. We should all be doing that, particularly in times like this. Okay, so now here's what's going to happen. We're going to go to the after party, the slightly shorter after party today. And what that means is we will stop recording so that we can be even freer and easier than we already were in our conversation. And that was a rolling conversation today, and it went fast because I was talking so much. At any rate, we will not be recording. Instead, we will just be engaging in conversation. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you, poof, will be in the after party. For those of you who are already here, just stay right where you are. And you too, poof, will be in the after party. So everyone, have a good week. There will be an offering from History Matters, a holiday appropriate offering from History Matters for next week. And then the week after that, we will continue part 2 of our kind of state of the nation conversation. So don't forget to pass along your questions in Q&A or to Annie. And for those of you who need to leave right now before we go to the after party, really have a wonderful holiday. Everyone deserves some rest and some time with friends or family.
Okay.